Good evening, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this truly inspirational setting here today and to be part of this year's Reading Climate Festival. My name is Tom Clarke. I'm a broadcast journalist who specialises in science and technology. I'm also a graduate of the University of Reading. As I came in on the train today, I couldn't help noticing not a huge amount has changed in the town since I left the uni in the early 1990s. But I was reflecting on the fact that since I left, it is more than half a degree warmer than it was, and that's the global average, by the way, not the current temperature, than it was when I left back in the mid-90s. And that's pause for thought, I think. And throughout my career, covering the issue of climate change and the decline of the natural world has been an increasing focus, and of course, an ever more pressing public concern. And while AI might have been dominating the headlines in recent months, climate change does remain, in my opinion, the greatest challenge that we face. Recent impacts of extreme weather have been making the headlines around the world. The wildfires, floods, and extremes of temperature now being experienced are all consistent with what climate scientists like those here at the University of Reading have been pointing to for decades. And we're at a pivotal moment in addressing those challenges. And the choices and changes we make in the years ahead, globally, nationally, and locally, will have consequences for centuries to come. Climate change may well be the defining crisis of our generation, yet many people still don't understand the issue or feel able to respond to it adequately, including the young people who, of course, will be most affected. The University of Reading has played an important role in recent years in influencing how we can better educate and support young people through climate education, particularly by bringing together a wide range of organisations to work together on how we can best meet this need. Tonight, our panel features several key voices in recent discussions around climate education, with a particular focus on empowering young people to tackle the challenges we face. With leading representatives from the education sector and NGOs, we hope for a positive and illuminating debate on how to better enable young people to address the challenges of the changing climate and the decline in the natural world. But first, it is my enormous pleasure to introduce the speaker for our opening address. As president of COP26, the climate talks in Glasgow in 2021, the Right Honourable Sir Alok Sharma, MP for Reading West, has played a leading role in driving action to address climate change on the global stage. And if anyone doubts or questions the amount of progress that was made at Glasgow, I had the privilege of being there to report on it from Sky News, and I can personally testify to the enormous efforts that Sir Alok and his team went to try and secure the agreements that they did. It was no mean feat and was a very hard-won achievement. Sir Alok continues to advocate for the urgent need to take action and transition to a net zero world. So please join me in welcoming Sir Alok Sharma.
Gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure to be here, and I've been giving speeches internationally, but it's so lovely to be able to do this in my hometown as well. And I want to start by thanking the University of Reading, the Vice-Chancellor, and everyone for not only putting on this event, but also for the enormous amount of work that they do on climate. And I think it's fair to say that Reading University has a reputation of being one of the leading academic institutions around the world, not just in the UK, when it comes to climate. And so please, could I have a round of applause for the University and the Vice-Chancellor? So 18 months ago, ladies and gentlemen, we were in Glasgow, some of us were in Glasgow, and the global geopolitics was already becoming incredibly difficult. And as you know, it got far worse in 2022. But we managed to get almost 200 countries to come together to forge the Glasgow Climate Pact. And I believe the reason that the countries came together to do this was because they recognized it was in their self-interest, their collective self-interest, to take action on climate. So what did we achieve? Well, we started off, the role of organizing COP26 was less than 30% of the global economy covered by a net zero target. By the time we got to COP26, over 90% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. We'd managed to mop up just about every single G20 country along the way. And the reason we were able to do this is because the UK has shown leadership through collective governments on this area. And as a result of that leadership, we were able to encourage and corral others to move forward as well. And the International Energy Agency totted up all the commitments that were made in Glasgow. And they concluded that if all of those commitments are delivered upon, we're heading towards 1.8 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And you will know this, that back in Paris, in the Paris Agreement, and then reiterated in the Glasgow Climate Pact, the commitment that countries have made is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So we didn't get to 1.5, we get to 1.8. And I said at the time, it was a fragile win. And that continues to be the case. Now, right now, the science tells us that we're at 1.2 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And it's worth setting out what the science was telling us over the last few years about where we were headed. So before the Paris Agreement came into force, the science was saying we were heading towards 4 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. Post-Paris, they said it was 3 degrees. Post-Glasgow, below 2 degrees. But we're already at 1.2 degrees. And I suspect there are very many people who will think, well, that's not very much at all. But you will all know the impact of that around the world. Flooding. Pakistan last year, a third of the country underwater because of a climate-induced event. I was at the UN General Assembly, and I had a meeting with many ministers, but also with the Pakistani Minister for Climate. And I have to tell you, it's very difficult to know what to say to a minister in a country where a third of that country is underwater. We've had flooding in China. You've seen what's happened in Central Europe during last year. In Australia, I was in Australia during last year, and I was told that what used to be 1 in 100-year events are now turning into 1 in 10, 1 in 5-year events of flooding. And there's a real impact. It's not just the immediate cost of clear-up, which can run into billions. It's the fact that there are very many homes and businesses that can no longer get insurance. And that is a pretty stark future for many people around the world. Wildfires, the same thing that you've been seeing happening in North America, you've seen it happening in Australia. In Europe, you've seen the harrowing pictures from last year. And I had an opportunity to go to a clean energy conference in Seattle last year. And as you fly over to get to land in Seattle, you see the wildfires that are raging. You see them from the air. And I have to say to you, I don't exaggerate when I say to you that it is literally like looking into the gates of hell. And that, unfortunately, is something that is becoming more prevalent as well. Record temperatures, we're all facing them. India, Pakistan, last year. I was in India when they were facing record temperatures, and I spoke to people who spend their livelihood working outside. Can you imagine what that is like? Day in, day out in extreme heat. There's only so much that the human body can take. And then droughts across Africa, across Asia. And we've seen this in our own country. Last year, for the first time, the mercury hit over 40 degrees. We had wildfires outside London. Very sadly, we had the loss of life as a result of the heat. And the reality is that climate change does not recognize borders. And I'm afraid the reminders for world leaders keep coming. Many of you will have seen in recent weeks a report from the World Meteorological Organization supported by the Met Office. And what that said was that there is a 66% chance that between 2023 and 2027, 1.5 degrees will be breached in at least 1 year. Now, they're not suggesting it's a permanent breach, but they are suggesting that it's more likely to happen than not in one of the next 5 years. And so what is the impact of that? Well, the prediction is that if you get to 1.5 degrees of global warming, 700 million people across the world will be in extreme heat just about all the time. At 2 degrees, that's 2 billion people. At 1.5 degrees, 70% of all the coral reefs in the world disappear. At 2 degrees, they're just about all gone. And I can give you a whole bunch of other predictions, and these are made by scientists. This is not sort of people just dreaming this stuff up. And we also know that climate change exacerbates existing risks: water security, food security, the prevalence of diseases and pests, the impact on infrastructure, migration risk. The UN has estimated that actually there have been more people in recent years displaced, many of them internally within their countries, but displaced from climatic events than from war. And there comes a point where if you can no longer support your family, you look to migrate. And you can imagine the impact of that on Northern Europe in future years unless we get to grips with this particular issue. And there is a big, big economic cost of inaction. Many of you will know Lord Stern, Nick Stern. He's become a great friend. But he is someone who wrote the seminal Stern Review a few years ago, and he estimated that unmitigated climate change could cost up to 20% of global GDP every year. In this country, we have an independent Office for Budget Responsibility. They've estimated that unless we deal with climate change, by the end of the century, our debt, our public debt, could be 3 times the size of our economy. That's pretty unsustainable. And I can see there are some young people in here today, and frankly, that is not a legacy we should be leaving for them. So we have to act. So what do we need to do? We know that to keep 1.5 alive, we need to almost halve global emissions by 2030 on 2010 levels. So where are we? In 2010, global emissions amounted to 50 billion tons. In 2021, there were 55 billion tons. Friends, we're going in the wrong direction. So, I've given you a pretty polemic outlook. Is there any progress? Yes, we are making some progress. 75% of all the emissions in the world are related to energy. And we're seeing that the rate of growth in these is slowing down. In fact, last year, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, put out information which showed that global energy-related emissions grew by less than 1%. And the expectation is that these will peak in 2025. Last year, renewables met 90% of the growth in electricity generation around the world. And that was because of a big expansion of solar, of wind, of electric vehicles. And people have said, what has been the impact of Putin's illegal and brutal war in Ukraine? Well, one of the impacts has been countries realizing that climate security, energy security, and national security are totally interlinked. And you are seeing a big acceleration in renewables as a result of that. And the estimates now is that by 2025, renewables, and I'm not counting nuclear in this, will be the biggest source of electricity generation globally. Look at electric vehicles. In 2017, 1 in 70 new cars sold in the world were electric vehicles. Last year, it was 1 in 7. By 2030, it's estimated to be 1 in 3. So we are seeing progress. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, made up of scientists, put out a report in March this year, and they said that every single sector has affordable clean technology options which can halve emissions by 2030. This isn't stuff that's got to come later. Yes, there are technologies that we're developing which are going to abate emissions. Yes, there are technologies that we're developing which will hopefully do more in terms of climate action. But we have technologies now, ladies and gentlemen. The problem is that governments are just not going fast enough, and that has to change. Now look, I'm someone who is pretty glass half full on this issue, and I think you need to be. You need to be hopeful about this. And I've seen for myself the impact in the business community. They have understood that if you get this right, the pursuit of a net zero economy delivers millions of jobs, it delivers economic growth, it delivers profit on the bottom line. 60% of the FTSE 100 companies, our top 100 listed companies, are signed up to the United Nations Race to Zero campaign that signed up to net zero with science-based targets. And so I'm hopeful, but we just need to go a lot faster. Now, we've got COP28 coming up in the UAE, and I just tell you what I would like to see coming out of that. I want to see strengthened emissions reduction targets. I want to see a commitment to peak global emissions by 2025. I want to see a plan to really turbocharge a clean energy revolution around the world. I want countries to commit to phase out fossil fuels. Last year at COP27, around 80 countries, including the UK, pushed for this. We didn't get there. I hope we might get there this year. And above all, we need to make sure that we scale up finance. You have very many developing countries across the world that want to do more, but they can't because of a lack of resources. And there's a lot of work going on right now about reimagining the international financial architecture so we can get a lot more private sector money in, go from the billions to the trillions into climate action. And again, I'm hopeful that we will get there. So today is about youth education. I just want to say a few words before I conclude, which is that if you look at public attitudes around the world, and by the way, as a result of the work that I did on COP, I had an opportunity to go to over 50 countries, many of them 2 or 3 times. And of course I met governments, I met business, but I also made a point of always meeting youth groups, always meeting civil society. And it's clear that this is an issue that matters across the world, to young people, in fact, to all people. Just look at the polling in our own country, recent polling that's been published over the last few days. Absolutely, the issues that matter most to people right now is cost of living and the NHS. I think we understand that. But the third most important issue for people right now, despite everything else that's going on, was still climate and environment. And that was basically in equal third place with the economy. So people in this country absolutely care, and that is across the world as well. And so what is the message that all of you young people should be sending to world leaders? Well, we live in a democracy. There are many countries that are democratic. In fact, even countries that are not democratic know that change sometimes happens if they don't respond to what their public wants. And you saw what happened in the election in Australia last year, where climate became a lightning rod issue. And we had a change of government. And so the message that I have for world leaders, including in my own country here, is that you have to recognize and act on climate if you want people to go along with you and support you. The final thing I want to say is that we've got COP28 coming up, we've got a whole bunch of other meetings, the UN General Assembly, G20, etc. I think we're past the point of fine speeches from world leaders telling us they understand the urgency of the situation, and basically they're not following through with policies which are designed to keep 1.5 alive. That has to change. We also need to make sure that they're delivering on the commitments that they have already made. And we know that the world is running dangerously out of time to act if we're to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And the current generation of world leaders will be judged by the young people in this room and future generations by whether or not they did indeed rise to the challenge of, frankly, the defining challenge of this century. I hope for all our sakes that they do. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Alok, for such an insightful and, I have to say, sobering introduction, which more than adequately sets the scene for our panel debate this evening. So let us get on and introduce our panelists. I've got a strict order here, which I've got to stick to, because there's slides, okay? First of all, Dr. Jonathan Dewsbury, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Department for Education. Jonathan, please come up and join us. Kathryn Brown, OBE, is Director of Climate Change and Evidence at the Wildlife Trusts. Professor Andrew Charlton-Perez is Professor of Meteorology at the University of Reading. And Eleanor Andrade is a youth climate activist working for Teach the Future and students organising for sustainability. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for taking the time to come and share your wisdom with all of us. So I'm going to launch straight into questions, I think. And the first one, I think, is, so Alok was just talking about it there, how do you feel younger generations feel about climate change? How can we best support them to understand the challenges and be part of the solution? I thought, Elle, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I thought you might kick off in terms of how young people understand climate, how you feel that is.
No problem. So my experience of going to school, so I left school 2 years ago now, which seems like so long ago. But my experience of that is that young people are aware of climate change. We see it on social media, we watch documentaries, we hear it on the news, and yet we feel like there's nothing we can do about it. We don't feel like there's anything that we can do to change it as young people. And it makes us feel anxious because it's this big issue that just isn't covered in our education. There's maybe a page in a chemistry book, a page in a geography book, and there might be a 6-mark question in a GCSE exam about it, but that's about it. We're taught about climate change currently in a way that makes us feel anxious because it's not taught as though it's a problem that we can actually do things about. Young people need to be taught that climate change is actually not a done deal, that we have the power to actually make changes to mitigate some of the impacts, and that young people can actually be a part of making this change. And yeah, so currently we're all pretty anxious about it.
I want to come on to anxiety in a minute, but Jonathan, seems it's your job to worry about things like this and how we're going to do better at educating young people about climate change. What would your response be?
I'd first say that we in the Department for Education have taken an approach to sustainability and climate change in the education system by working with young people like Elle and Teach the Future. So when I started my job, I landed on my desk 105 letters from young people expressing their anxiety about the future. So the first thing we did as a department was to meet those young people and work out how we prepared a strategy for our education system that prepares it for a future that will be very different from what it is now. So we've set a vision that the UK education system, so whilst the Department for Education has responsibility for England, we've set a vision for the UK, so England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, on how the UK education system can be a world leader in sustainability and climate change education by 2030. And in that we set out 4 really clear strategic aims. We want to make sure that our young people are prepared with the skills and knowledge for a very different world from which they're currently in. When I think about my own daughter, she's 5, she'll graduate into a world or go into an apprenticeship in a world and an economy which will be having a completely different mix of jobs, nature-based jobs, different jobs in the power sector, all those types of things. We spoke about how do we ensure that we adapt our education estate. Sir Alok started to refer to the risks of climate change. Those risks are in the UK education system as well. The threat to our education system from COVID in terms of the impact on education outcomes is well known, and thus the economy. Those reign true with climate change, the risk of flood, overheating and drought if we don't adapt our education system. So we've set out a strategy to address net zero, changing skills, adapting, and then also trying to leave a better environment for future generations. And in that strategy, we've got a large number of different initiatives that we're working directly with young people and organisations around the country to deliver that change. So we're at the start of an 8-year change programme for the UK and the English education system.
Just reflecting on Sir Alok's introductory remarks, I mean, this is a very urgent problem. You know, are we doing enough, and what more could we do? I mean, do either of you, Andrew, Kathryn, want to jump in?
Yeah, I can start with that one.
Can you see each other, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, as long as you can. I don't want you to talk over each other, as long as you've got line of sight. Carry on.
Yeah, so previous to my current role, which is at the Wildlife Trust, I was leading the UK's National Climate Change Risk Assessment, which is a legal requirement that we do every 5 years for the UK. And it's a report that anybody can go and read. It's on the gov.uk website. And it sets out all of the risks from climate change to the UK for the next 100-year period, including the present-day risks as well. And I've been working on, it's called the CCRA, Climate Change Risk Assessment. I've been working on these pretty much my whole career, so started the first one back in 2009. And in that assessment, we talked about climate change risk as a future issue, and the 2020s were a future time period. And of course, now we're talking about climate change impacts in the present day. Yeah. And you look at the level of action that's underway and the level of risk, and if you compare those assessments, you can see that the level of the risk has gone up quite significantly for the UK. So we know we're not doing enough, and Sir Alok has put that very eloquently, and that's coming from someone who has been, leading the global effort to try and achieve a very, very difficult global transition. We're basically asking countries to change their entire economies, and that is a very slow process. But there are signs of hope, and one thing that we've seen a lot of actually is growing awareness. Love to hear from the audience about this when we get onto it, but we've absolutely seen a real shift in public awareness at all age groups, really, of climate change risks, and particularly risks from heat. If you asked in sort of Ipsos surveys 10 years ago, most people would say that the risks from cold were the things that were going to get worse with climate change, and that's flipped completely. And now we see really good awareness of the risks of extreme heat. And obviously it's because we're all experiencing that. I mean, today is not particularly an atypical day in terms of extreme heat, but obviously we all experienced a really severe heat wave last year. And we're actually coming into a period now for the next few years because we're seeing an El Nino forming, which means that we're going to be experiencing much more severe impacts. But they're very hard to predict over the next few years. So I think we will keep seeing more records breaking. But absolutely we need to do more on mitigation and adaptation, preparing for climate change impacts, and on nature as well, which we'll come on to later, I'm sure.
Yes, I have plans for that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that Kathryn said. I think just to come back to the education piece, I think what's been really interesting over the last 5 years or so is that the momentum and the desire for change has really been driven by young people, by Elle and her colleagues in Teach the Future, and their advocacy, their clear passion for making things better for the next generation of young people, I think has inspired a lot of us, the government through John and his team, and through all the other organisations, the university and many other partners that we work with, to do more. And I think there's never been a lack of desire to do more in the education system. I think what's changed and where the momentum has come from is the desire to join that up and to do it together, because this is a big change that we're asking for. If we're asking for all young people to have a much better climate education, we're asking to change the education estate. I think it's something like 1/3 of public sector emissions come from the education estate. It's a big mission. We have to all get involved in that mission.
I was not aware of that statistic, and we'll hopefully come on to that in a second. But Elle, you mentioned something very interesting in your the answer to my first question, which was about anxiety. The threat of climate change is so enormous. I think to a lot of people, to young people, it presents a huge source of stress and anxiety. And I think with that, I mean, you tell me, is there not a danger of disengaging people switching off, thinking this is too much to cope with? Is that the case? And if so, what do we need to do? And how does the curriculum need to change? How does education need to change to try and change that?
Well, I suggest that, and part of the reason that Teach the Future exists is because we're a bunch of, the young people who volunteer for Teach the Future all came into the campaign because we felt alone and we felt isolated because we went to school every day and we'd have lessons and this and that. And then we'd look on our phones and see these stories about climate change, and it would never come up in school. And we felt like we were the only people who knew about it and who cared. And so one of the reasons why climate education is so important is because it creates a community of young people through their schools, which then extends out to their towns and villages, where they can actually connect with other people and use their education to lead the changes. And this will prevent young people from being isolated, and it will give them a community to actually improve the world and to address climate change through, which should hopefully, theoretically, counter some of those effects of climate anxiety.
Jonathan, that must be something that's come up. I mean, you must have heard it from people like Al as well. What's the plan? What are you going to do to address that? And also to maybe, speaking to the point you made earlier, educate people about the change, about opportunities, as well as the definite
Absolutely.
threats.
And we spent lots of time talking to Elle and her colleagues about trying to formulate the strategy and making sure young people's views are at the heart of it. I think it's a really interesting paradigm that we've got a generation of young people incredibly anxious about climate change. But if you look at the UNESCO study around the quality of education, 70% of young people globally can't explain the principles of climate change. So you've got an audience that are really worried about it, but aren't necessarily understanding how it comes about. And we've also seen from the Das Gupta report that young people from their mid-teens are more disconnected with nature than ever. So we've set a strategy that is about hope and truth. So make sure the truth and the facts about climate change and biodiversity collapse are clear, but giving hope for the future. And in that, we're hoping to give young people agency and practical skills to help them develop. So two examples. One is the concept of the National Education Nature Park. This is the idea that if we thought about university, college, school, and nursery land all together as one piece of land, and treated that as a national park and empowered young people to look after that park, they might reconnect with nature and thus are inspired to protect the environment and at the same time learn really important skills in terms of nature conservation, in data analytics, in science, in terms of mapping biodiversity. And alongside that, we've launched the Climate Action Award, which is a setting-based qualification that supports the curriculum in ensuring that young people have an outlet to practice skills and knowledge that they've learned through their formal teaching within the classroom. They are open for registration now when they are going live in the autumn term, being delivered by the Natural History Museum and the Royal Horticultural Society. And we're really proud of those schemes, and we've developed them with young people. As a really brief example, it was called the Climate Leaders Award. Young people said this is actually about action, not about leadership now. And so we've made sure that the stages of the award are all about action and practical projects and scientific projects that can make a change.
Amazing. You mentioned a statistic there about the number of young people who don't understand the principles, the fundamentals of climate. Why is that? I mean, it is complicated. You do need to have an understanding of atmospheric science, a little bit of one. It's a big system, it's a complex system. I don't know why I'm looking at you, Andrew, but you're the scientist here. I know I've relied on you before to try and explain to a general audience the latest bit of climate science, but is this just a tough challenge, or are there simple changes that be made, or changes that be made to the education system to improve the way we teach it throughout education?
I think both from survey data, from really great work that Teach the Future and other organisations do, and anecdotally from talking to teachers and school leaders at the schools that many of you are involved in, there are a series of challenges that build to that position. I think one challenge is around the training of our teachers, and Unfortunately, many of the teachers that teach in our schools and colleges now come from a generation where they had no training in climate science, and so they find this a very difficult subject to engage in. In my view, it isn't that complicated, actually, the basic science that we're trying to teach young people. But I think teachers feel at sea. There's lots of information available, but they perhaps didn't have training when they were training to be teachers. They haven't had professional development. And those are things that teachers, when we speak to them, call for. When professional organisations that represent teachers, they call for them as well. And that's why it's part of our own action plan, and it features very strongly within the Department for Education strategy. I think, like any change, it also comes from leadership all the way through the system, right? So it comes from the direction that the Department for Education and others set, our government sets, but it also comes from school leaders. It comes from other people who influence how teachers teach, what they teach, and to make sure that teachers don't believe some of this material is controversial. There's always a worry, I think, and you know that very well from your work in the media. Often these things are portrayed as kind of areas of false balance or opposing positions. There's so much about climate science, climate change knowledge, which is uncontroversial, and we should encourage people to know that and be comfortable teaching it. And that's a key barrier as well, I think.
I mean, Kathryn, feel free to jump in, but I was just going to go back to Jonathan there on teacher training. I mean, is that something that you have a handle on, and is it an issue that needs to be addressed? And if we can, maybe, Kathryn, you could help us out with this. What do young people need to know? What do we need to do better on in terms of fundamentals? Come on to that first.
So specifically on initial teacher training, that's something that the department sets a framework for, but then it's the responsibility of teacher training centres to deliver that. So the likes of Andrew and universities like Reading, other universities will set what they deliver there. But we're absolutely looking in those frameworks about how we make sure sustainability is embedded within those frameworks that universities and other training centres are accredited to. We've looked at, so the thing that, and I think Andrew expressed it there, the thing that teachers often ask us about is more support. So the various things we're looking at is we've looked at the CPD for science teachers to make sure that the climate change is properly within that CPD. We're working with a group run from the University of Reading, the National Education Climate Action Group, who are looking at how they might quality assure resources available. We are providing more teaching resource through the National Education Nature Park system. And we're looking at making sure the primary science model curriculum has got climate change fully embedded through it properly to support primary teachers. I think
because that's certainly a criticism I heard before. I actually worked with an organisation that was trying to push for more climate teaching in primary schools. There was quite a bit of resistance to that from primary teachers, saying this is a bit, some of these concepts are difficult for a primary school, for the primary school level. Is there progress being made on that?
Well, it goes probably back to your first point around what we convey about teaching truth and hope. And I think if we look at early years framework, it's about connection with nature and teaching the outside. And the same way through primary, it's about the teaching of the weather cycle and those types of things. And it's then perhaps introducing the scarier, to be frank, aspects of climate change at a more appropriate age.
Got it. Okay. Now, of course, what I'm itching to talk about, Kathryn, is as we were discussing it before, is a natural history GCSE. Because I don't know about how many of my panelists share this, but my introduction to climate change was through a passion I had in the environment and in biology. I learned about climate much later in my life. Could that be a gateway, I suppose, to, and it sounds from what you're saying, Jonathan, that that's the plan, to educate children more about what value there is in the environment around them and how dependent we are on it? Sorry, but I'm going to ask Kathryn to I'm just looking at you. Sorry,
absolutely, that's the gateway. That's why we've launched Natural History GCSE. It'll be available for students from 2025, is because we fundamentally believe around the connection to nature underpinning our strategy, connect to nature, protect the environment, make better educated choices about how you consume, how you choose your career paths, etc. But I'll pass the Wildlife Trust to talk about the benefits of nature.
Yeah, we're thrilled, and if anyone has children of the age where they might be doing their GCSEs in the next few years, then do ask them to consider the natural history GCSE. We and many others have been campaigning for this for years, and we're really, really delighted that it's coming on stream. And of course, being the Wildlife Trust, we're absolutely passionate about everything it's going to cover. And yes, it could well be a gateway. So I'm the same. I think the first teaching I had on climate change was at university. Yeah. And I remember it very clearly. It was doing my zoology degree. And it was a lecture, a single lecture on climate change. That's all I had in the whole of my education. On the way here, I texted my nephew and my niece, who are both 12, to see whether they'd covered it yet. They're both in their first year of secondary school. And actually, my nephew gets the causes of climate change. He was saying it's fossil fuels and cows farting. They like that. So that was very important. They've got an EV and a petrol car, and he understood that the EV was better than the petrol car for reducing emissions. The thing we don't see very much of, certainly at primary and lower secondary level, is understanding the difference between mitigation and adaptation. And we even see that, having worked on adaptation for a long time, you see that everywhere, that there is a struggle.
I have a problem explaining that distinction to my editors who are grown-ups and are supposed to know better.
Yeah, so adaptation, preparing for the impacts of climate change, so dealing with wildfires, dealing with flooding, dealing with heat waves. We don't see quite as much awareness of that coming through, and obviously we're going to need to be doing a lot more of it in now and in future years, so that's something I'd like to see addressed. But Natural History GCSE, hopefully, will be covering a lot of this.
And does that resonate with you? Does that make sense? Could that be a way of getting young people interested earlier?
So I really like, the idea of the GCSE, and it's something that Teach the Future has been somewhat involved in the development of. But it still repeats the problem that already exists. The climate education is currently siloed during GCSEs into chemistry, into biology, and into geography. And everyone does chemistry and biology to different levels because the GCSE science system is complicated. But not everyone does geography. And even then, the content is only taught depending on what's going to be on the exam. And so because it's rarely going to be more than one or two questions, often in the lead up to exams, if schools are running out of time, which has been a huge problem with coming back from COVID and the lockdowns, climate change is one of the things that gets skipped over, which means because everything is being taught to an exam and so students can get marks. And so what we actually need is for climate education to be woven throughout the entire curriculum as a thread, so that students whose skills maybe aren't in geography or the sciences can still connect with climate change and see and understand how they can take action and what they can do to mitigate it, which will also just benefit us in other ways, because it will mean that students can use empathy to connect with climate change and look at it through the arts, through languages, and connect with other cultures as well. And I do really like the idea of the natural history GCSE, and there will be some students who really, really, truly benefit from it. But at the same time, I do have concerns as well that it's going to be repeating problems we see already, where the schools that are the worst off have the biggest problems getting students through exams and getting through all of the content in time, and getting teachers trained to teach about climate change as well. And so there is a risk that only the schools who are a bit better off and in wealthier areas will be able to actually put on this GCSE, and that's just been one of my main concerns with it.
Forgive me if you've already threaded this into the answer to a previous question. I may have been thinking about the next one, but is that part of the strategy, to see climate in other topics? I mean, I'm thinking religious education. The Bible is full of pestilence and famine. History is replete with stories of environmental and climate change leading to various geopolitical shifts. There must be opportunities to put climate elsewhere in.
Absolutely. There are opportunities to put climate change in throughout the curriculum. I think there's a slight nuanced debate here around the national curriculum, which is a very thin skeleton that runs through the education system and the curriculum that a school chooses to teach. And so academies have the flexibility to choose the curriculum they teach, which they typically base off the national curriculum. And so the approach we are taking, and we agree with Elle in that we want to see sustainability and climate change embedded through the school system, and the college and university and early years system. So we've done that through the initiatives Nature Park and the Climate Action Award, but equally we're also, we've set out a position where we want all education settings to have a climate action plan in place by 2025. And in that climate action plan, we'd expect an education setting, so their leadership team, their teachers, their pupils, and their local community to come together to put together that climate action plan and outline their approach to climate education, because every school will do it differently. I was at a school, Fairfield High School in Bristol a few weeks ago, who have taken the UN sustainability goals and embedded them entirely through their curriculum. We don't want to specify it through the national curriculum because we'll lose innovation like that, which is happening in really good examples across the country. So in their climate action plan, we'd like them to set out their approach to climate education, their culture or their psychological attachment to how they're planning sustainably through their operations, how they plan to decarbonise their school estate or their school building, how they plan to restore nature, hopefully through the National Education Nature Park that we're promoting, and then how they intend to adapt their estate. We spoke about the risks of overheating. That's a risk that we are concerned about in terms of the risk of overheating on concentration and potentially educational outcomes. So we hope that that approach to climate action planning, a really action-based system, and we're putting in support. So we've just launched a £5 million procurement to put in a support system and a network of advisors that will go out and directly support schools in helping to put that in place. And I'm pleased to say that the University of Reading have been piloting some of the climate action plans with local schools in Reading.
Great.
And I think just to build on that point of the kind of golden thread of drawing this material through the curriculum, Sir Alok made that point very eloquently, right? The climate this is not just an issue of rising temperatures or heat and drought. It's about our food security. It's about our national security. It's about all of those areas where young people may wish to work, they care about, they need to know about. And I think one of the key changes in our approach to this has been thinking about how that material can be threaded through the curriculum. So there's a really fantastic piece of work that the Royal Meteorological Society has been leading and will launch in the next couple of days, which really outlines very clearly how climate change can form part of your food technology lessons or can form part of your art and design lessons. And actually, that's a real change for, I'm a member of the Royal Meteorological Society, have been for a long time. That's a real change in our thinking around not just advocating for more science, but advocating for a more holistic view and putting in place things that enable that to happen. And that's happened through volunteers, through people like me who are involved in the society, who've looked at what schools teach, what they could teach. And it's about that sense of possibility and hope that John referred to earlier.
And how much, as you were just outlining to me, and forgive me, I'm not an education specialist, I'm more of the science guy, but do we have good metrics across, given schools are a very heterogeneous sort of across the UK, and as you mentioned with academies as well, even more so now perhaps, do we have good data on what's being taught in various schools when it comes to climate, sustainability and nature?
We have some data, but one thing we've committed to, and I think this kind of sets out the approach that we're doing this very differently to how we've done other policies within the department. We're doing this in a really open way, in a really collaborative way with partners across the country and young people. We are, first of all, committing to asking young people to evaluate how our strategy is progressing, and they'll do an independent evaluation each year, which is a brave thing, I think, for any government to do, to put out a statement from young people directly against their own progress. But we've also then committed to a climate literacy survey, so to actually test from school leavers if the initiatives we're trying are actually making a difference. So in answer, direct answer to your question is we have some data currently, not enough data, and we had a baseline from this summer's school leavers, and we'll be then revisiting that each year to see how that's improving and if we're actually making a difference.
Okay. The science on climate, it moves very quickly, and I try and keep pace with it, and I'm a journalist whose job it is to cover it, and I struggle to keep up. How are we going to make sure that the latest climate science and the best climate science makes its way into schools, makes its way into young people's minds?
So I think one of the really fantastic advantages that the UK has is that we have a world-leading climate sector. We have fantastic world-leading research. We have fantastic NGOs and charities that talk about climate and know about climate. And one of the things that we have put in place to try and support that kind of continuing development, continuing transfer and dialogue on the science, it is a new national scheme of climate ambassadors. So we set that up in the last year with our partners at STEM Learning. And we already have 150 ambassadors, all volunteers, prepared to give up their time to go and work with schools, work on their climate action plans, bring that latest science into schools. And I think it's really, again, a sign of the momentum that we were able to sign up 150 ambassadors really without very much effort, if I'm truly honest, because all of those experts, all of the people working on climate, they have some connection with the education system. They work in the education system, they have family in the education system. This is something they're engaged in, they want to help with. And it's been really inspiring to me, actually, to talk to some of those ambassadors. And I guess coming back to the point around anxiety, and we may touch on that again in a moment, but I think it's not just young people who feel this sense of anxiety. I think it's all of us, actually. I think people who work on this every day, we feel the anxiety as well. And we all need a sense of agency, of doing something positive, of making a change which has meaning. And actually, many of the climate ambassadors I've spoken to have spoken that that's their motivation here, that they can do something, that they can see it has a tangible impact. And that actually helps them with their own eco-anxiety.
Yeah. Now, I think we've already touched on this because we were talking about the natural history GCSE. I think I may have leapt ahead in my order of questions here, but I think about this a lot at my work, and I'm talking to my editors about it at the moment, that you could see climate change as a symptom of a much wider problem. Humankind's overexploitation of the resources we've got, and it's the decline of the natural world that we really need to focus a lot more on. And yeah, is that part of this, rounding it out, really trying to, rather than, I mean, you mentioned siloing climate, is that in a way, and I'm not, as a climate scientist, I don't want to try and push to one side, but do we need to take a more holistic approach?
Absolutely. And so, yeah, so the problem is with education is that we currently are mostly only teaching about the kind of cold, hard facts of climate change and what is happening and what's going to happen in the future, and not actually what individuals can do and what communities can do. And so I do think what you're saying, John, about the climate action plans within schools and having members of the community being able to feed into them is really important, because it is that sense of empowerment for young people in their communities. But yeah, so that's as good as keeping up to date with all of the science is. It's not just about science, because that's where the anxiety is coming in, that there's this really scientific thing that people are, young people especially, are trying their best to understand. But we do at some point have to ask the question of, do we need every single young person to understand every specific detail of what's happening, or do we just need them to know how to act?
Well put. Fantastic. I just want to come back to the built environment and schools, and given the extremes of heat we saw last summer, and I know that affected schools, we looked at ventilation during COVID. Obviously was a big challenge for the Department of Education, but is equally relevant to the estate. It's a tough question, probably maybe better put to one of your political colleagues, but have we got the money to do what we need to improve schools? And also, Kathryn, I was just thinking, seeing as you've wore an adaptation hat for a long time in civil service, what your thoughts are on that, and also whether it's an opportunity for education as well. I mean, I'm thinking about my daughter's primary school, and they had solar panels. That actually became very much part of their education, and they had little modules on it and all that sort of thing. Is there an opportunity to teach as well as we try and help schools improve?
I mean, you'd be surprised if I sat here and said there wasn't enough money to refurbish 28,000 schools or 80,000 buildings. I think what I'll say is that the government has a school rebuilding programme, and it's actually really forward-leaning. So it's committed to rebuilding 500 schools over the next 10 years, and all of those schools are net zero in operation. So we committed to that at COP26, and the first of our schools was built in net zero operation last August. So that's net zero in operation. But we're also really looking forward at COP26 when, with the support of Sir Alok, when we brought education and environment ministers together for the first time to talk about the intersection of education and climate change, we hosted part of that in a completely natural prototype classroom made out of natural materials. And so we've committed to building at least 5 schools the next year out of natural material, with the hope or the vision that one day all of our new schools were built out of completely natural material. Because we know that if young people are taught in natural material, I think the research is Turner 97, your heart rate lowers and you lead to better concentration, which obviously has an improved educational outcome. So we are really passionate about how we can move our estate towards natural-based solutions and more outdoor teaching and more outdoor interaction and outdoor space. And there's natural benefits for doing that for adaptation as well. If you introduce more plant life, you can introduce more shading, prevent runoff and additional from flooding. So we think, if we then think about the skills that we require and the learning you get, if we can involve young people and teach them in buildings that are designed for net zero in natural material, they can see the transition to net zero in front of them and therefore be advocates and agents of that change moving forward. And we could also potentially be the catalyst for the green skills. I mean, we hear a lot about there not being enough heat pump installers or not being enough EV charge points, etc. But if we can use the education estate where we spend over £1.8 billion a year on building, on refurbishing the education estate, 15 billion since 2015, we have the opportunity to create that pipeline and that confidence in green skills and green pathways for the future.
Yes.
Yeah,
that was a very informative and thorough answer, but if you do anything to chip in.
Yeah, I've worked a lot on overheating buildings in my life, and actually DFE is brilliant on overheating in schools. They've got really good policy and they've really shifted in the last few years. Care homes, hospitals, people's homes, offices are all still quite a problem. Care homes actually have done quite a lot of work over the last few years. But coming back to the natural environment angle, we know a lot of the measures that we can all take, whether it's schools or homes or care homes, is about using nature to help reduce temperatures. So increasing shading, green roofs, green walls, putting climbers up your walls, having shading from trees, not cutting down trees that are near your house for fear that they're going to fall on you, but using them for shading. All these things make a huge difference. Not paving over your front garden for parking, but keeping it green. All these things are really good for climate change adaptation, and we're seeing some increasing awareness of that, but not a huge amount. But certainly the schools agenda, we've seen huge strides forward with a lot of the schools programme, and that awareness of using nature to help to tackle climate change certainly is something the Wildlife Trust do through their Nature-Friendly Schools programme as well, where they're going out and helping to inform teachers and children what the benefits are of being in nature.
And Tom, if I may, the vision here is that if we push forward really hard with our building programs to enrol nature in those, and we start adapting our buildings, at the same time we're asking education settings to set out a climate action plan for how they take that psychological connection to climate change and plan for a future, and then empower young people to rewild their own school site through the National Education Nature Park. We're creating an education system there that is putting nature and sustainability at the heart of it, and therefore hopefully leading to a behavioural change of 16 million people that are in the education system now, and making the right choices moving forward.
Amazing.
I mean, just to build on that, I think the really brave schools are the ones that will involve those young people at all stages in those plans. We already heard from some schools where they're aware of the growing green economy that Sir Alok talked about, and they allow young people to be involved in the project management of the changes that those schools need. And what better way to learn those skills than doing it in the environment where your work every day and your community lives? I mean, that's a great start to help you along that path to a greener job.
Does that resonate with you, Al? Does that make a lot of sense? I can't find much to disagree with in that.
No, I absolutely agree. I do think it's really important that young people can actually see around them what they're working towards, and then they can take that home and out to the rest of their communities, and we can make schools work as the centre of a community that is inspired to act, and we can see it in practice. We can have young people learn these ideas, and it can really become a hub for the community and a leading point.
Just moving on to parents now, because we talked obviously a lot about young people. What's the role of parents in supporting kids on and engaging with this an issue? And also, I assume, a role for parents learning from their children. You know, that is the trickle-up benefit of education, I guess. Someone want to comment on that?
I mean, I think that's also true. You know, Teach the Future have had an SOS have had a really interesting program of Teach the Teacher events, actually, where sometimes young people have greater knowledge of some of these issues than teachers themselves. I'm sure Elle could talk more knowledgeably than me about that. But I think the same applies to parents, right? I mean, we've all seen the articles recently in newspapers, on our news websites, talking about that very process happening. You know, young people being very educated and helping to drive behaviour change for their whole family, actually.
Yeah, so climate change and climate action is a really intergenerational effort. It must be. And so Teach the Teacher, just to cover that, is this campaign where we find interested young people in their schools who are worried about climate change and want to do more and want to have an education that reflects that. And we train them up to give these presentations in their schools, to their teachers, to their head teachers, about how they feel and what climate anxiety is doing to them, and why climate education would be really important to them. Because as much as the DFE can tell schools that, oh yeah, you should incorporate climate change, what's really impactful in a bit of a guilt-tripping way to teachers is actually having young people express to them why it's so important, because it's a lot harder to say no to student space when they're saying, please tell me about this.
Absolutely. Any thoughts from you guys before I move on?
I think I would just say it's, as a parent, what I try to make sure is just to get is any anxiety that comes through is to try and convert that into positive action. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's that fact checking and making sure what that is driving the anxiety is right. And I think it's really good where we're looking at supporting a body that can quality check resources and scientific knowledge about climate change to make sure the right science is being taught and explained.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly, when we had wildfires breaking out around London, I came home smelling of smoke after covering that for the day. And my kids were actually worried. They didn't know, because it was the way it's reported on the news, it's filling the screen. It's like, it felt a lot more immediate and terrifying than it actually was, although I didn't want to play down the seriousness at the same time, but I do remember having to sort of coach my kids carefully through that one. We talked about, Soraya talked about, someone's just mentioned it here, skills. And this is, I think, thinking more towards higher education and training. How do we best prepare? What can we address in higher education in terms of skills for that new economy? We've talked more about earlier parts of the education system, but it seems to me there was a lot of need to improve that as well. Jonathan, can you kick us off on that one?
It's always a dangerous question for a DFE official to answer a question about a university when there's one sat here.
Sorry, I'll come back to Andrew.
It's okay. I think what...
I was thinking more maybe because
I'd say from
it's not just about academic training. I'm thinking about things like heat pumps, things like sustainable materials, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, all the things in our strategy you would expect the higher education sector to follow as well, and to think about their own estate. I think how that could be used as tools for teaching. We've seen some really great examples across some universities where in your induction week, as well as working out how the library reference system works, you're actually getting a base training in carbon literacy. So no matter what subject you're doing at university, you're getting a grounding in the importance of carbon in your education. I think in terms of, we're working with universities through the Green Jobs Delivery Group. So we've committed, along with the Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero, and with DWP and with DEFRA, to publishing a net zero and nature workforce plan by 2024. And so we're at the moment working with industries, and Andrew sits on one of the task and finish groups in the Green Jobs Delivery Group to set out what do we need in terms of pipeline for the forestry industry, what do we need for manufacturing, what do we need for hydrogen, what do we need for all these different sectors. And then we're going to look at the department has a 3.8 billion skills program from FE to HE. How do we need to flex that skills program to make sure we're meeting the demands of the students moving for universities and going into careers?
Great. And I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I mean, I think there is actually an interesting contrast to be drawn between FE and HE, and this is dangerous when my Vice Chancellor is sat right there. But I think my interactions with colleagues in FE is that they are much further along this path than generally HE is. They've recognised the challenge. They've recognised that many of the roles that they're training young people to go into have already changed, are changing. Sir Alok made that point. That's a point we make already on the Green Jobs Group, that this is here already. This change is already happening. We have shortages in a number of these industries that are preventing us making the changes we need to address our climate targets. And so FE have kind of got on board with that. I think for HE, because there are maybe a broader range of roles that graduates from HE go into, we haven't quite so much recognised that challenge right now. But I think many of the examples that John talks about are things that we have to grapple with. And of course, students in both FE and HE are fantastic advocates. We have one right here who is a current student in HE who will hold our feet to the fire about this. And they are ultimately consumers in a market. If they don't see institutions have the values that reflect their values, they will choose to go elsewhere. So it's in our own interest, actually, as HE, to make sure we meet the needs of our students.
Fantastic. Now, I do want to take questions from all of you guys as well. I believe there are some microphones out there. If you have a question for our panel or for me, I was thinking, seeing as I'm someone who talks about climate change quite a lot on the telly, there's a gentleman. Oh, there's loads of hands coming out. Right, I think your hand was up first, sir, at the end of the row there.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Some very good initiatives here. And I certainly feel less pessimistic than I did when I first came in the room. But I'm interested in your panelists' thoughts about the fact that climate change is a global issue. And how do you see these initiatives being spread across the globe, right? How do we, these are very much UK initiatives, but how do we make them global?
Who wants to take that?
Can I?
Go ahead. So please just jump in if you need to, guys. Don't.
So absolutely. And so if we looked back to COP26, with the great support of Sir Alok Sharma, we brought together education and environment ministers together the first time, and we got 28 countries to commit to changing their education system around the world to consider the intersection of climate change and education. The impacts are being felt so much quicker in education systems around the world. A couple of weeks ago, I was sat very, very fortunately for dinner with the South Sudan education minister, and she spoke about how floods had destroyed 600 of her schools, and the type of flooding on the low-lying land they had, the water hadn't yet receded, and pupils were turning up in a foot of water with their books waiting to be taught, but teachers couldn't get there. So the impact is real, it's happening right now. And so what we are trying to do from a UK perspective is to convene countries around the world to form the Greening Education Partnership with the support of the UN and make sure that we embed solutions to education in climate negotiations. We started that momentum at COP26. We continued it at COP27, and at COP28, we've got commitment from UAE to have a whole day on education, and we hope on day 3 with the leaders event to have a leaders event around education and get an ongoing custody of making sure the countries that are committing to doing things to their education systems are actually doing them, and thinking about how we work both Global North and Global South together to help adapt through things like global partnerships for education as part of the World Bank, how we make sure those development funds are helping, so we're working very closely alongside the FCDO. So my team are incredibly passionate about this, and we very much see our vision about, for us to be a world leader, we have to help and convene others around the country to do that.
Anyone else want to chip in on that? Okay, I'm going to go to another question. There were some hands over here. Oh yes, you sir in the white shirt, seeing as you're close to the microphone. I've seen you guys at the front though, so I'll come back to you next.
Thank you. By way of introduction, I'm a 15-year-old young person in a 68-year-old's body. When I was 15, Joni Mitchell sang Big Yellow Taxi, which led me to look at the book by Rachel Carson on the harm being done to the environment by pesticides. And since then, I've been paying attention. I've been one of those people who for decades has been trying to get the people in power to halt and reverse environmental damage. In all that time, it's just got worse. And it's got more disheartening and frightening because the people in power who are choosing to do the wrong things and failing to choose to do the right things have known a lot more about this than I have as an interested bystander. Now, the first thing I'd like to hear is that we're told the truth about everything, and the truth to me seems to include things like what George Monbiot said in today's Guardian about us being currently on course for a 2.7 degree rise above pre-industrial levels by 2100. I think the Climate Action Tracker backs that up. Presumably, if he's wrong, Sir Alok or someone else will get him to print a correction. The signs are that he's right. As Greta Thunberg says, it will be nice to have hope, but we can't have hope without action. And I'm not seeing the action we need, given the scale and urgency of this existential environmental crisis. Now, it's happening already. It's not something young people are going to have to deal with. They're already having to deal with it. We know that things are going seriously wrong all around the world. It's getting closer and closer to us. My great aunt was one of the people whose house was damaged in a wildfire at Wellington last year. I was one of the volunteers who built the Reading Community Hydroelectric Scheme. Because of last year's weather, the River Thames the flow was so low and slow, we could not generate for about 3 months. This is happening now. People are dying. This is really serious. We're effectively at war with ourselves and with the environment that supports us. What Putin's done's added to that. The question is...
The question, yes, go for it.
It's not a problem for young people to deal with. We all need to be doing this and educating people, not just young people, everyone needs educating, particularly our power holders, businesses and governments that continue to do what they're doing. It's costing the earth.
Yeah, I get your point. Can I just put it to the panel? Because only because I don't want to rush you. You've made some excellent points, but I do want to get some questions from other folks. But I think what you're telling us here, this problem is too urgent to wait for the children we're educating now to be in a position of power. I guess we haven't got long enough to do that. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's right. I think that this is one piece of the work that we need to do to educate everyone, actually, and you know, the festival that we're in this week and the fact that we have this wonderful globe here in the town hall is part of that, right? It's part of engaging people at all ages from all walks of life in discussion of this problem. You know, and I guess it wouldn't be fair for me not to put in a plug for our own climate stripes. You know, you've seen our climate stripes on the bus in Reading. You've seen them on the sleeves of the Reading football shirt. They're meant to give us an opportunity to start those conversations and for educated people like yourself, sir, to have those conversations with people that otherwise might be quite awkward to start, and to provide the fantastic information that you've just provided to us, to as many people as possible as you meet. It's the job of all of us to tell people about this and to advocate for the changes that we need.
Anyone else want to reflect? Yes.
Just to add very briefly, I agree with everything you've said. The UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries on the planet, and we don't often realise that we are far worse in terms of nature loss than most other countries in the world. A lot of that is due to past agricultural policy. It's not farmers' fault, it's the policy that's driven those changes and led to a huge loss of wildlife. But you have to keep going, you know, even when you don't have much hope, and I'm more of a glass half empty sort of person. Having worked on climate change and nature loss for a long time, some days are really hard, but you have to keep going anyway. And there are some fantastic examples of brilliant things that have happened. Yesterday, DEFRA put out an announcement saying it was banning all fishing of sand eels this year to protect puffins. You know, there's things like that coming through that are really important, and you have to grab onto those and make sure that you keep that in perspective, I think, about what the picture really looks like, because it's very, very easy to get sucked into the negative consequences and all of the bad stuff that's going on around us, but we do have to keep hold of some of the positives as well. And actually in the media needs to keep hold of those as well, because we don't often hear about them that much.
I would say definitely a challenge in the media to report on positive stories.
I would just say that's in your example, that's really important, to make sure that we're heeding, you know, those really positive things that are happening, even though it's not enough at the minute.
It's a criticism I would willingly accept. Yes, sir, you there at the front. It's just coming your way, the microphone.
I sort of agree with the previous speaker a little bit, the question. I remember COP 14, COP 15. My children were very small, and they're now nearly 20, nearly 19, nearly 15. And at COP 15, my daughter came home from school with part of the eco team, worried about polar bears, turning off the lights, and 15 years later, just not interested. And anecdotally, none of her friends are. None of my son's friends are. None of my 15-year-old daughter's friends are. And back then, there was activists and people wanted to get into schools to teach climate science. 15 years later, we're doing the same thing, and in 15 years' time, perhaps those children will be completely indifferent. Maybe we don't need to get science into schools, but technology, policy, solutions, adaptation. Why science? Whether it's 4 degrees, 5 degrees, or 6 degrees, or 3 degrees.
It's too hot.
That's irrelevant. Whichever temperature it is sort of irrelevant. To give children hope for the future, you talk about policy or adaptation, mitigation. The science is sort of, I won't say irrelevant, but you know, if it's between 3 and 6, well, you still got to do various degrees of adaptation and talk about, do you want a technology future? Or, I read today that Elon Musk, Tesla, has an ESG rating of 35 compared to a tobacco company that has a really high ESG rating. So I don't think climate science needs to go in schools. It's solutions, policies, adaptations, not just the fear, what to do about it. Let's build a reservoir. We haven't built a reservoir in this country for 50 years.
Okay. Seeing as there was a little bit about that, something that you said there resonated with me, the fact that people switch off. There was some interesting data, I think it was yesterday, the Reuters Foundation reported on how young people are increasingly disengaging with the media in general, the news, and that is obviously where a lot of people get information about the climate from. Elle, is that frustrating to you as someone who's very passionate about this? Do you feel that young people, we are losing too many of them, or is this...
Yeah, it's frustrating, but I have to be honest, I can understand it, and I'm jealous, if anything. I wish I could switch off from it. And I think one of the problems we have with young people, especially, I can't give you the answer to how to get them engaged, because that's why I'm a youth activist, because I want to get more people engaged. If I knew how it would be done, it would be over. But yeah, so one of the problems we have among the youth population currently is that a lot of us are really burnt out, be them people who have been active and have been campaigners, or just people who struggled throughout COVID and throughout the lockdowns. There have been a huge increase in problems with mental health among young people, a large part of that down to the effects of the COVID pandemics, and social media means that we can never fully switch off, which isn't a fault of social media entirely. It's that we're constantly connected to everything and everyone, and there's no way to really escape that, the news without feeling guilt. And so I do think that young people just have so much coming at them currently, that climate change is just yet another thing, and there's so many things to feel bad about and to be worried about, that it's inevitable that a lot of people are going to get switched off. And I wish I could tell you, how to keep people engaged, but I can't.
I mean, I think just coming back to the point about the climate action plans, it's really important that those action plans for education settings are actually not just about the science. They are about actions. They're about the mitigation in schools. They're about adaptation in schools. And part of what's really powerful about them, and of course, this is a policy which has not been put into practice yet. And you might come back to me in 5 years and say, the same thing has happened again. We've made an attempt and we haven't got very far. I think what's powerful about them, though, is that they are holistic. They deal with all of those things that you very eloquently talked about. And John's been very clear and about the involvement of young people in shaping that policy and also in delivering those plans in education settings. And I think that's the powerful part. I think that gives me the sense of momentum and the sense of hope that we are going to do this in a holistic way, and we're going to do it with people, not to people.
I just wanted to answer the bit about adaptation. So in our climate action plans, the support service that we'll be offering to schools, it will play back to them the specific risks that they have. So if you're a school in Southend, your risk is more likely to be around water scarcity as opposed to a school in the northwest of England where it's more likely to be flood. So, and then directing them to services to help them take practical action. I've got my team of scientists assessing the risk of overheating, drought and flood to the education system, and so that we can use that data to make practical steps. I just wanted to say something to the room about hope. I'm not a half full, I'm a full glass type of person. And in the Naturalist Museum, there is a whale that sits above the Great Hall, because in the 1920s, whales were on a decline, and policy that was thought about in Naturalist Museum and taken to government and changed resulted in the increase of the blue whale population. And that is why that whale is called Hope. And so I'm a glass full type of person.
Thank you for that. I'm very sorry, I missed some questions at the back there because my view was slightly obscured by the lights. I'll take both those questions one after the other if you could, because we're sort of running out of time. So let's take both these questions. If you could keep them as short as you can, that would help us get through as many as we can.
Okay, and try and keep it very quick. I agree with you about hope, and I think we're in a school. One thing I think I worry about is, I'm very fortunate, I've got somebody very passionate that delivers the curriculum. We've written a curriculum from reception up to year 9 that is delivered right the way through the school. And we have an action plan. And lots of schools are doing things, but they have lots of other things on their plate as well. So why are we getting schools to reinvent the wheel, and why aren't we finding it easier for schools to be able to work together with all the other pressures that they're dealing with mental health and all of those other issues as well? We need to be able to make it accessible and easy for them and the staff working in their schools to be able to work together and share these ideas, because educationalists will share anything. And I agree, working from hope, we started ours, we teach ours from a basis of hope. From the Damien Gamu's 2040 video is an excellent way of teaching them from a basis of hope, because that gives you the solutions.
Thank you. We'll answer that in a second, but I think the lady in front of you had a question as well. Can I take that too?
Yeah, it was just to say how Reading, like many towns and cities across the country, has got an incredibly rich third sector community groups, conservation organisations offering wonderful opportunities. And I just wondered how we can bridge the gap between schools and colleges, universities, with those opportunities right on their doorstep, which I think, we've mentioned already about how being immersed in nature can actually lead to pro-environmental behaviour in itself. So how can we maximise those links?
Thank you.
So on the first question from the work already happening in schools, thank you, and that sounds like you're doing amazing stuff. So thank you on behalf of the work you for your pupils. And I totally agree about the sharing. So we expect both the National Education Nature Park and the Climate Action Plan Support Hub to be an opportunity to share those best practices across the different schools, so they can build on that best practice. And we absolutely do not expect to recreate or do new action planning. It's about making sure that psychological connection to nature sustainability is built in. And there are brilliant examples of schools doing this, and showing those examples to schools that haven't quite started thinking about it. So you are totally spot on, and I totally agree with you. In terms of the third sector, I just say we've just provided £15 million of funding to the most nature-deprived schools to do specific nature-based projects. So there's an opportunity for them, those types of organisations, to get involved in helping to deliver those projects. With the schools, we'll have a little bit of funding to help actually do practical things. But I would imagine Andrew would talk a bit more about the National Education Climate Action Group.
And just to say very briefly on the third sector as well, obviously I can't leave without mentioning our local wildlife trust here, which is Berks, Bucks and Oxon Wildlife Trust, BBOUT as it's called. And they're brilliant. I mean, they're doing brilliant natural flood management around Reading. They've got brilliant nature reserves around the city. If you've not been to one, please go to one. They're lovely. We take Alok out to them once a year if we can get him to go as part of his constituency work, and it's lovely to go and see them. And BBOUT have fantastic relationships with universities, with businesses, and brilliant volunteering and apprenticeship opportunities as well. So if anyone's interested, just go onto the website or drop me an email and I can put you in touch with the right people. But we are doing that. It just needs more scale, really. But there's a huge amount going on at a local level, the grassroots level, to make sure those connections are made.
Andrew?
Yeah, so just very quickly, we run a group called the National Climate Education Action Plan Group, which came out of our summit. It's open. We welcome people coming along. We meet every 6 months or so to share some of the work that's going on. So you'd be very welcome to come along and join that if you'd like to. I think linking across is such an important part of the policy and what everyone is trying to do in support of that. Not trying to replace, for example, the UK Schools Sustainability Network. It's a fantastic organisation. Schools, from the ground up, trying to work together on these things. And I'm always massively impressed, actually, by how schools do work together and how they share ideas. On the third sector point, absolutely, we should involve those organisations. While I have the soapbox, I'm a governor of a primary school. We desperately need governors. All schools need governors. If you want to get this work into schools, become a governor. It doesn't take much time, but you can advocate for it. You can help schools shape their climate action plans. So one action for you all to do when you go away tonight.
Okay, I've got time for one last question. There's a hand up at the back. I'm sorry, I haven't got time for everyone. I'm going to take the person at the very back of the room over there, if that's okay. I apologise to anyone who hasn't got their questions in. Try and grab us at the end if you can.
Hi, so I'm a student at University of Reading and I'm studying Masters in Agriculture, and we have a lot of climate change we talk about, but I'm not from England, I am from India. And so when I come here and I see every supermarket just goes like made in Malta, produced in India, from Congo, from Colombia, and then every tag on every commodity goes like made in China, made in Vietnam, and that just makes me wonder, we are educating people, we're educating the schools and everything, but how are we educating them about everyday choices that are causing such big carbon footprints? Like, yes, we are in globalization, but are we really promoting it, or are we trying to curb the impacts that are coming this way?
Tell me about it. I think we all just agree with you on that one. But if anyone has anything to add.
Just very quickly, yes. The thing I would love to see, and the government was doing it a few years ago and then kind of stopped, is to make sure that everyone has access to a carbon calculator or a sustainability calculator, so we can all work out our own footprint. And you can do it with some jiggery-pokery on the internet, so I go on and use spreadsheets and work out what my carbon footprint is per year. But everyone should be doing that as a matter of course. It should just be something we think about every day. But the tools and the information isn't there for the public to use, and I would love to see government policy prioritising that over the next couple of years. But yeah, we all agree with you.
I think it's fair to say that successive governments have failed to push hard enough on a very powerful food industry in the UK to do better on that, if just taking that particular example, but I know it's something that there have been repeated efforts to do.
I think one of the recommendations from the independent review on the net zero strategy by Chris Skidmore is around the public awareness campaign and the labelling of eco products. So I think that's something that the government will have to respond to in due course.
Yeah.
I think there's only so far, though, that having these options available can go, because and there's only so far that having public awareness can go, because a lot of people currently don't have the option of buying exclusively food that's grown in this country or clothes that are made ethically. And it's a really huge problem that people cannot actually afford to live. I mean, I'm living on a student budget, and I try to buy from just the Whole Food shop around the corner from me. I am very well known to their reduced section, but I can't afford to do my entire weekly shop there. And there's millions of people in this country in the same position. And so we also, it doesn't just come down to do people know what they need to be buying to be sustainable, but are people actually able to do that? And so we need to look at how we can actually reform the economy. There are some ideas about circular economies and things that are really interesting, and actually look about and reconsider consumption and how much we consume, whether this needs to continue, you know, whether there are ways to reduce consumption overall and not just replacing aspects of it, but also look at how we use things. Are we able to get them repaired? Are we able to get them fixed? Are we able to sell them on to new people and buy second hand? And that's where we maybe need some intervention in, and the government could help and enforce this.
Al, thank you very much. Look, I'm very sorry to say I'm going to have to bring this evening to a close now because we've run out of time, which leaves me with nothing further to do really than thank you all very much indeed for taking the time, for sharing with us your understanding, to Alok for his opening remarks, which really got us off to a great start. I hope that tonight we've learned something about what we need to do to empower young people, but also I think learned a lot more about the scale of the challenge of what we've got to do and the urgency of the problem related to climate change and our ever-declining natural world. I mean, I'm just sort of awed by this. I mean, it was looming over us at COP26, so I'm familiar with Luke Jerram's Gaia, but I was just reflecting. I Googled it while you were talking. I know I should have been paying attention, but I wanted to check. It's 1.8 million times smaller than the planet Earth itself. I don't know if that shows us of the huge scale of the problem or just actually how small and precious a planet we live on. I'm not entirely sure. It's hard to get your head around 1.8 million, but it certainly gives me pause for thought. So thanks again very much to the University of Reading. I'm delighted to be part of the Reading Climate Festival, which of course they support. And thank you all very much for your participation and excellent questions this evening. And if you want to know more, it says in my notes here, there's a website, a few websites behind me that you can visit to learn more about how to get involved. So thank you very much again to all our panelists and to all of you for being here. Thank you.